why should we get rid of it? So we are going to be talking about everyone's favorite hook
We did it,
today,
Reddit.
which of course is useEffect. And so I know it might not be everyone's favorite hook, but we're going to talk about it because it personally for me has caused a lot of problems, and especially like even from when I was starting with React and React hooks, and even till now, like there's just a bunch of things that can go wrong. So first of all, if you're struggling with useEffect, don't worry, because even senior React devs, struggle with it. People who have been doing React from the very beginning, and even those people, we all have the same experience like with React hooks, because if you've done class components, it's like all that knowledge sort of goes away once you start using hooks. But that large dependency array, the ones I'm talking about, the complicated if statements, I mean, those are typical, it's just a really awkward hook. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And if I wanted to summarize my slides, like if you have somewhere to go and you want me to just summarize it real quick for you, I'll just say useEffect is not for effects. Now, so this might actually leave you a little bit confused. So how did we get here?
Use event coming out in the middle of this talk is indeed funny. Good call out, Maple. About a third of the complaints I've seen about useEffect could be solved by useEvent. About a third could be solved by various like async things, like React query, and the other third are genuine ergonomic, like rough edges. I think useEffect gets more shit than it deserves, but I also get it, and this one in particular, I think, makes pretty good points, but I'm excited to see how it goes.
So when we were doing effects and class components, how many of you remember that? Where are my elderly React devs? Okay, so we had three places to put them. We had component did mount, right? We had component did update, which is whenever we had state come in or some props change or something, we're like, okay, that's a really good opportunity for me to fire an effect. Or component will unmount. And so this is a good place to do unsubscriptions or to do some sort of cleanup. But these were the three main places that we had in class components to do effects. So now what do we have? Do we have those same three places? Well, with the useEffect hook, if we pass an empty dependency array, we have component did mount, sort of. We're going to talk about.
I'm trying to decide how much I want to rant right now. I do. Okay. And here's where Theo starts to bitch. Let's say I have a chat widget, a chatbox.tsx. It exports a component, chatbox. It takes a property, a prop slug. That's the chat room you want to connect to. And there's a component did mount. And in that component did mount, it subscribes using the slug that it got. Now let's give it a different slug. Component did update now needs to maintain that logic. It needs to do an unmount and a remount. So it's doing the work that the unmount has to do, as well as the work that the mount has to do. And then there's will unmount, which does the actual unmounting. So if I have a component that takes in a prop to choose which channel it connects to, I now have to write the connection and the disconnection logic twice, because I need to handle the mount case and I need to handle the update case. In the update case is doing two things. It is doing the unmount behavior of removing the listener and unsubscribing, as well as the mount behavior of attaching the listener and subscribing to it. So in here, we are not just duplicating code, but we're duplicating code over an unintuitive component level flow that doesn't give a fuck about which data changed. Let's say that chatbox also takes a prop for light mode or dark mode. If we blindly do the update, or in component did update, blindly disconnect, reconnect there, then we'll disconnect, reconnect whenever you toggle dark mode. If we don't want to do that, we now have to do a comparison against previous props to make sure they changed before triggering the disconnect, reconnect. Yeah, it's rough. So Humanoid said, this is why you don't want, or this is what you don't want for sockets. No, if you have a component that you give it a URL, you give it a slug, which is which socket it connects to. You explicitly do want it to disconnect and reconnect to a different slot. If your WebSocket connection wants to be maintained and you want to change which channels you're subscribed to on a given connection, you should do that by having a separate effect that runs on the slug that is separate from the one that runs on the connection. The problem is with this architecture that's being shown in the screenshot, you cannot do that. You don't have that granular control unless you re-architect the components themselves to Hawk style, hydrate in a client, and then the child is where the unmount, remount behaviors are done, and you have to separate those. But now we're writing 6 functions instead of 2. I hate this. And I don't, if the framing of this is going to be things used to be simple when we had component did mount and now they're too hard, I'm going to go fucking in on this. So let's hope that's not the angle he's going here.
Or to do some sort of cleanup, but these were the 3 main places that we had in class components to do effects. So now what do we have? Do we have those same 3 places? Well, with the useEffect hook, if we pass an empty dependency array, we have component did mount, sort of. We're going to talk about some footguns there in a bit. We have component did update, where we could say, like, if these things change, then I want this useEffect to run. And we also have component will amount, sort of. Like, you have this empty dependency array. It's really awkward. You have a function inside of a function. We're not Haskell. What are we doing here? So I just want to say that useEffect is not a lifecycle.
Yeah.
And so a lot of us think about, like, okay,
oh, no.
effects, we're used to, just putting them in lifecycle hooks.
Do I just let him talk, or do I pause and bitch more?
And React 18 actually makes that really, really clear. Also, the default behavior of useEffect is an infinite loop. And so you might be thinking, like, okay, I've been using effect enough to know that I need a dependency array, right? And so everyone should know that. So why does everyone run into this, like, infinite loop scenario? So here's an example.
Pause. Cool. We're ranting. So, yeah, I'm here to react to this React content. As I just said, you're making up a case in the middle here. This was an attempt to show that this old mental model poorly maps to this new model. Yeah, the old model was bad, and now we can be more granular with when actions and cleanups occur. This hurts. This slide in particular shows what I consider a bad faith approach to the problem, which is it's not one-to-one, but it's like apples aren't one-to-one to oranges. But if the orange was fucking poisoned, we wouldn't talk about it a whole lot. Like if oranges were bad and we have concluded as a community that oranges are bad, we wouldn't be comparing them to apples all the time. This is like we're comparing an apple to a poisoned mushroom. It's like, yeah, this apple doesn't follow the same shape as the poisoned mushroom very well. Yeah, no shit. Yeah, I don't like this so far.
Haskell, what are we doing here? So
a lot of people are confused about this because a lot of people are trying to rewrite code one-to-one with a different pattern. Yes, the community has agreed. The greater React community of people who make architectural decisions around how React libraries are maintained and optimized, stuff like that. Like the greater React community long ago accepted that the old component will update model was bad fundamentally, and we are very happy with where we've moved. The people you see complaining about useEffect are, for the most part, incompetent engineers that are mad because they forgot to pass an array. I agree, there should be a required array. I really don't like that useEffect doesn't require the second param. It should. You should be forced to pass an array and determine when this thing re-renders, or maybe have an option that is like always re-render if you really want that case, but I don't think anyone ever does. Generally, the useEffect complaints are from people who don't understand the consequences of what a mount is and does and what updates mean and do. useEffect isn't something the average React developer should have to touch a whole lot. And yeah. Yeah. The old way of doing things with component did mount, component did update, component should mount, component should update, component will unmount was not better. And anybody who argues that is doing such in bad faith. And if you have someone who's arguing that regularly and they're down to come on the show and talk about it, please. There is nothing I would rather do than ream somebody who thinks React class components and class component functions were ever the right way to do something, because they weren't. That's just wrong.
I just want to say that useEffect is not a lifecycle hook. And so a lot of us think about like, okay, effects, we're used to, just putting them in lifecycle hooks, but useEffect is not really for that purpose. And React 18 actually makes that really, really clear. Also, the default behavior of useEffect is an infinite loop.
This is bad.
So you might
I'll
be
admit
thinking,
this
like,
is
okay,
bad.
I've been using effect enough to know that I need a dependency array, right? And so everyone should know that. So why does everyone run into this like infinite loop scenario? So here's an example. Like I just have an example where we set count plus 1. You might
I just saw your message, Maple, about the dependencies for effecty effects like binding event listeners. My take there would be I would almost always prefer to have the event listeners calling against a ref and update the ref rather than doing that at no, because you still need an effect to update the ref. Fuck. Yeah, you're right. Use event does this effectively. More good points. Maple, you're like 3 for 3, making me walk back my own stance on things. Goddamn.
might think, okay, this is a side effect. This is only going to run once. But in reality, we have this happen, okay? So useEffect is also not a state setter. You could set state in it, but if you need to set state, you could do that in other places too, okay? This has been like one of the biggest problems, especially in the very beginning when I was making API calls, and when you put fetch requests in there and they start looping infinitely, things go really, really wrong. So this is another example, and this is actually straight from the React docs as it exists today. Not the beta docs, but the actual React docs, where do you see something wrong here? There's no dependency array. So this seems like, I flew here all the way from Orlando. It really feels like when I went on the plane and I saw no one with masks, it was a little bit dangerous, a little bit uncomfortable, and sometimes ugly. So it just feels weird. But thankfully, the React documentation does.
We actually just found a fun hacky lint rule that requires you to pass an array to useEffect. I almost went and like patched the types to require it, but the lint rule was fine. I think useEffect should always have an array, and if you don't want that, you should have to like opt into that behavior another way.
Does introduce this idea of a dependency array, but it's at the very bottom. So you have to scroll all the way down, and it's a tip. It's like, hey, here's a cute little.
Totally agree that you should rarely call useEffect. Not only should you rarely call useEffect, you should probably never call it in a component directly. If you're writing a useEffect, I almost always push for you to throw that in a separate hook that's named like use join call, use start chat server, so that the effect has a description and a name that is maintained in a place, and then you call that name and that behavior somewhere else. It does a good job of like isolating, at least like mentally, what each effect is responsible for. And generally, if you can avoid more than like one effect per parent like hook, that can make managing these behaviors significantly easier. It's when you have like 5 effects in a component that these things go bad. But if you had 5 behaviors in a use component will update, your life's a lot worse. So that's why I hate the argument here. It feels like another one of those, this thing is so good that it's bad because it doesn't work for these things and people use it the wrong way. Whenever a tool is really good, I'm trying to remember how to put this. A tool is good when you see it being used poorly all the time, because that means it's so good that everyone started using it and they've started trying to use it for things it's not meant for. And we see a lot of that with React and the primitives that it provides. It's so powerful that it's bad. I like that way of framing it. Yeah. How would we make something that's not as dangerous? I don't know if that's React's responsibility. I think that that's the community's responsibility to take the primitives React provides and make them useful. I will never trust any one vendor to be the ones to provide the ergonomic use cases. Once we get down to ergonomics, I don't want one owner. I want as many owners as possible and as much flexibility in that ownership as possible. And that's something that I only get in React. Like React doesn't tell me how to do styles. React doesn't tell me how to do animations. React doesn't tell me how to do anything other than turn data into components. And I really like that. I don't want React to tell me how to architect around my effects. I want the community to come up with things like React Query, like Zustan, like Jodi, like RTK Query, and all the RTK toolkit stuff. I want the community to continue evolving around the primitives React gives us so that every day my job as a developer can get better. And that doesn't happen when one shop owns everything. And this is why Svelte will always be limited, because Svelte will only be as good as what Rich feels like doing. I really like the way Maple just put this. Although if education around useEffect is evolving out of the gate, useEffect was always meant for synchronization. Recognizing that makes things 80% easier. Totally agree. Very good point.
Little tip, you could, use a dependency array, but now all of us know, like, we need that. So, here's what we really expect when we use effects, now that we're used to all these foot guns. We think we're gonna do this effect whenever something here changes in the dependency array. And we're like, okay, that's pretty simple. I could do that. I could, manage my effects that way. But the reality is a little bit different. And my slides aren't exactly working, but that's okay. So the reality is more that we have a big if statement in there, and we have a big dependency array, and it's just a little bit weird. And so one of the reasons for this, and one of the reasons why we tend to use useEffect, is because the imperative approach to doing effects is when something happens, execute this effect. It's like a do this. Like, that's the definition of imperative. So what's the declarative approach of useEffect? Well, when something happens, it will cause a state to change, or props to change, or something in the component to change. And depending on which parts of that state changed, which is a dependency array, this effect should be executed, and that should only happen if some condition is true. You see how confusing that is? Oh, also, React may execute it again because of concurrent rendering. Okay, we have imperative, we have declarative, but really, it's more like this is implicit, or this is explicit, and this is implicit. And I prefer explicit over implicit. So, when we use effect, we have this, like, just massive, crazy Boolean jumble. And you know how much I love my Boolean variable.
Yeah. Does he not show a component should update example next to this? This is so bad faith. Why can't people be mad at something without comparing it to something worse? So I want to be very clear here. Before hooks, doing this in a class component wasn't like, how do I put this? Before useEffect, doing this was so much worse because it was mandatory. For every single one of those ifs, you would have to build a ton of checker logic and each of the paths for all of your props. So you don't have an array where you don't have an array where you choose what triggers the effect. You have props and state, both of which trigger all of the update functions every run, and you have to check the old and the new every time to decide which side effects you run. The class component version of this was very similar. The difference was there was 100 lines of code instead of 5, and if you had more props and more state, you have to exponentially increase that amount of code. This wasn't viable before, motherfucker. Why are you comparing the lifecycle things at the beginning? Just don't bring up the lifecycle shit if you're going to claim it. If you're doing a comparison here, we already agreed these things aren't similar. Give us some context and show us one example of why we made this move, why we went this direction, because it is so much better in so many ways that you are consciously not only ignoring, but misleading people into saying shit like, I miss component will update. No, they don't. You're tricking them into thinking they do by being fucking dishonest. I didn't take off my hat. It fell off when I was being grumpy. Anyways. Where were we?
Variables, like I see them all the time in useEffect. And here's a few examples, by the way. I'm not going to name any of the companies, but
Svelte even said that Svelte's limited to what Rich wants to do. That's part of the Svelte as a language article. You should read it. He's working on it. It's something he's actively trying to do better at, but until it's been done, I will continue making that joke.
I found this just an open source.
Love you, Rich.
And really, it's not their fault because useEffect's just an awkward hook. You know, we have these conditionals, really long dependency arrays. Here's another example. Here's one of my favorite examples, which isn't actually there. If you want, come find me. I will show it to you later. It's by, again, one of the companies I will not mention, but it's a really fun one. So where do effects go? I'm talking about the.
You know what? I've had to write this before. It sucks. Doing like weird React element shit within your effects is always painful. As soon as I see the word overlay inside of an effect, I get a little bit scared. This is not great.
It's a really fun one. So where do effects go? I'm talking a lot of crap about useEffect. So where should these effects go? When we're looking at the components, we see there's a few possible places, right? We know that we can't do any side effects in render. We already know that we could use useEffect, and we're going to talk about when you.
He's going to put it outside.
But it is a little bit awkward. So where's left?
Yeah.
Maybe outside the component. What does this look like? This is weird. Like we're supposed to have everything inside our components, right? So yeah, if you decide, this actually is a good use case for useEffects. Like I'm listening to what David says, but I'm going to put it in there anyway because that's just what I'm used to doing. Here's a problem. React 18 will execute your effects twice on mount in strict mode. How many of you have used React 18 and have been bitten by this already? So a few of you. The others, you'll experience it. It'll be bad. And so what happens, what React 18 is doing is we're mounting the component, which will cause the effects. Then we're unmounting it, which is simulated in strict mode. And so that will be a cleanup of the effect. And then we remount it. And so it's going to be executed again. And so the reason it does this is because it's trying to tell you that you're not using useEffect for its intended purpose, which is what I'm going to talk about. So it's really sussing out all of those effects that really shouldn't be there. So useEffect really feels like useDefect at this point, and also like a foot gun. So you're like, why am I using this hook? And what is useEffect really used for anyway? So the answer is useEffect is supposed to be used for synchronization. And I suggested that useEffect should really be called useSynchronize because you're supposed to use useEffect. That is really confusing to say, by the way. You're supposed to use effect when you have something that you need to synchronize with. So examples would be a subscription like this. And also Dan says this as well. I feel like my slides have no credibility unless I have a Dan tweet on there. So he says this as well, that if you don't use useEffect, or if you're trying to manage your data with useEffect, you're going to have a lot of problems. It's really used to synchronize it with some external system. But another classic example is just tracking things in the DOM. So adding event listeners like a pointer move, doing your cleanup.
This is what most of my effects look like.
Dependency array as small as possible. So we have two types of actions, or effects really. We have the synchronized effects, which we just talked about. Those are the subscriptions, the event handlers, all of that. And we have action effects, or what I call action effects. These are your fire and forget effects. And again, with React 18, you are going to have that unmount and remount happening due to strict mode. And if you turn off strict mode, React 18 is going to do it anyway because of some concurrent rendering. So this is just something you have to be careful of. But typically, effects that are based on synchronization are safe to stop and remount, just because they're not those one-off action effects. So then where do action effects go? And the answer, the official answer, is actually event handlers. So whenever possible, you want these effects to go inside of things like onSubmit, onClick, things like that. So I both like and don't like this answer, even though it's the official answer, because we're doing imperative logic. It feels like it's inside of render, but it's not. It's actually happening outside of render. And also you have implicit code in your code base. So when we look at the beta documentation, which hopefully you've all read, they're excellent. One of the things it says is that event handlers are the best place for side effects. And so further down the documentation, when answering the questions where you can cause side effects, it says that these side effects usually belong inside of event handlers. And so when when concerning useEffects, like when do we actually use useEffects, we say that, or the documentation says that this should actually really be your last resort. So you heard it from the documentation. Maybe you heard it from me first. Maybe you should read the documentation before coming to my talk, and then I wouldn't have to talk about this. But I actually really enjoy talking about this. So yeah, the problem is when we put effects inside of our components like rendering lifecycle, then we run into the problem, like we talked about in React 18, where these effects can execute multiple times because they're at the mercy of the component rendering. But if you put them in the event handler, now you don't really have that problem. Like, it doesn't matter how many times that component's going to render, these effects are actually going to only happen once, because it's guaranteed in React that when you go from state to state, talking about this like a state machine, then these effects, this transition will only happen once, but rendering might happen multiple times.
Quick story time, because one person I don't like on a team I like was talking shit recently, and I have a feeling she's hate watching. She knows who I'm talking about too. So yeah, if you're that person, fuck you. To everybody else on the team I'm talking about, miss you, love you. Y'all worked hard. There was a bug on Twitch, and I have been away for long enough. I don't care talking about this one. There was a bug where sometimes when a user opened the dashboard, it would immediately trigger an ad on their channel. The reason for that, I'll just show you guys my dashboard, because why not? A thing in there I don't want you guys to see. See this button, this run 1 minute or run 30-second ad break button? I'm actually going to click this right now, so if you're not subscribed, you're not going to hear the next 30 seconds of this rant, so make sure you're subscribed. Anyways, as you see here, this button's in a loading state. Fun fact, if I was to hit edit here and reorder my quick actions, that state gets persisted in local storage. Why? Bad architecture. Fundamentally, just bad design decisions were made on how this was stored. And this is stored in local storage, and it includes the state when you store it there. Another fun fact, that trigger when I click the button was not bound to me clicking the button. The action of clicking the button is not what fires the button. That button gets fired when the action state is mounted. There's 4 components for each of these buttons, one of which is named action. And when action is mounted, it has an on-mount effect that fires that. Because we were storing too much shit, this would load into the state that local storage had it saved in. And it would load you into action state if that's what it was in when you last edited your actions. And because that was such a bad, buggy experience, after that, the team would immediately wipe the state to ready state. But it fired the render for the action state. So just by loading this page with a bad local storage state where the ready state is triggered here, refreshing this page would trigger ads. And this is not per channel, this is per your local storage. So if you fuck this up on your channel and then you go to another channel that you're an admin for, you will trigger ads on their channel just by going to this page. How long did this take to debug? I was not on call when this happened, and I was still relatively new to the team. The ads team was insisting it was this team's fault. The on-call person insisted it wasn't. I jumped in because it sounded like fucking chaos. I sat there for like 2 hours screen sharing with the ads team, going through everything before I found the disaster that was how this was being recovered locally. And I figured it out and fixed it. Turns out the bug came back recently because somebody deleted the code, because I had bitched a lot when this happened. Like, we need to re-architect this because it was built wrong. And the response was, you should stop being so mean. So I shut up about it and quit a few months later. And then they reverted my fix that I wrote unit tests for, specifying in the unit test, hey, if these fail, it's because you deleted some very important code. Make sure you know what you're doing. They did it, and they had another outage where ads were running in the middle of big plays during big streams because this was a poorly architected thing. Your bad React code has fucking consequences, and to the team that I'm talking to right now, get your shit together and stop subtweeting me, fucks. Sorry, I'm a little angry. I'm really mad that they think they can talk shit behind my back and that it won't get to me. And they're this bad at coding? Yeah, no, I'm talking shit now. Sorry, guys. Sorry. The good ones know who I'm talking to. The bad ones know it more. Get your shit together, creator org. Anyways, the reason I went on that rant is because the effect, which was... Yeah, the effect that we wanted to run is when you click the button, an action should occur. That needs to be bound to the clicking of the button, not the rendering of the component. And that failure was John, you need to chill. You're going to lose the best hair title. Fair point. Let the content flow through. Yeah. Bind your actions to your actions. When somebody clicks a button, that's when the action should occur. Not when you mount a different state that mounts a different button that has a use effect that then fires your action. That's like 5 levels of bullshit that you've consciously chosen to work in because you like components too much. Like, let your buttons be buttons, let your functions be functions. Stop putting actions in your component logic. Cool. Maybe I don't like useEffect that much.
So effects happen outside of rendering. But
soda, not
I have
beer.
a little
My
bit of
bad.
a problem with this. If you start putting your effects inside of event handlers, then you get into some messy situations where it might look like this. Again, my slides aren't showing all the slides, but this eventually expands where you have is loading, you're doing set loading, set error, you might do a fetch inside of there, and you might do a lot of state management, and all of a sudden these event handlers become multiple lines long, where you really want to keep it just to one line. So in React, a popular mantra is that UI is a function of state, and so that whatever state you have, it's going to render a UI. And so we could actually derive this whole idea, which Redux popularized, where given a state in an event that happens, now you have a next state. So the problem with this, though, is that you really have no place for effects. It doesn't really fit into this function. So where do effects happen? Well, we have many different answers from many different state management libraries, like middleware, callbacks, monads, I think. But the real answer is straight state transitions. And it always happens in state transitions. And so the reason for this is that the only way that you could trigger an effect is to
This lecture in front of a cemetery. This was somewhere in Oakland, if I recall. Yeah, monads. I got a little triggered when he said monads.
So something needs to actually cause that effect to happen. Effects can't just happen out of the blue. And so typically, if you catch it within the event handler, then that's a great place for an.
I really like this. Your state changes should happen for a reason, and the reason shouldn't be another state change. It should be an action of some form.
And so typically, if you catch it within the event handler, then that's a great place for an effect. So instead of just this whole idea of a state, and when you get an event, you get a next state, we have state plus event equals next state and effects. So this is called managed or declarative effects, where, by the way, if you have your bingo cards out, I am talking about state machines, so you could mark off that box. But state machines, like this model over here, of state and event equals next state and effects. This is all you need to understand when talking about a state machine. Like this is how state machines work. So in a state machine, you have an initial state, and you might.
Yo, Slay Enjoy, thank you for the
and
sub.
In the transition, that's where you define the effects. So you could say when this event happens, like load, then this fetch data effect also happens. And so that equation just becomes a really convenient way to define, hey, this effect is supposed to be
Title is Reactathon 2022 Day 2 live stream. They haven't split this into VODs yet, so we're skimming.
executed when we transition.
It's about useEffect being
the
bad.
other states. And these effects aren't executed, by the way. They're basically handed off to something that's going to interpret that and say, okay, I'm going to save the state, and I'm going to take these effects, and I'm going to execute them. So your state machine, these transition functions still remain pure. And so there's
Let me some pure
cool
functions.
features with state machines as well. You can see that the fetch data is happening in both the load and the reload state. And so state machines have this idea of entry, exit, and transition actions as well. So it's pretty convenient. So how can we do this? Like, how can we eliminate useEffect and actually execute effects while we're dispatch or like just handling events? So I have this hook here called spicy dispatch, and no, I'm not going to make it an NPM library.
Pay me before you follow.
I'm just putting it on the screen to be spicy. But our dispatch here is a little bit fancy because inside the dispatch itself, we're getting the next states, and we're determining which effects should be run given the state, the event, and
Need
the
more
next
of those.
state. So basically, that's state transition because those are the three parts of it.
You have Turbo. Should you still sub? Duh.
And we're executing those effects. Now, this is this is left as an exercise to the reader, but you could just say, okay, when the state is loading and I just came from the idle state, then I'm going to execute this effect. But the main point
Yo,
here
Chip
is
Wheel,
that
thank
all
you for
this
the
is
sub.
happening within the dispatch itself. And so when you think about when you dispatch stuff, that's happening right in the event handler. All right, so where do action effects go? event handlers.
Green's
right?
frozen. Oh yeah, I'm on the wrong scene. Thank you for that call out. What if I fuck that one up for a minute?
Not really. So they really happen in these state transitions. But these state transitions, especially in React, just so happen to be executed at the same time as these event handlers.
Make sure I rewind a bit.
Okay, when the state is loading and I just came from the idle state, then I'm going to execute this effect. But the main point here is that all of this is happening within the dispatch itself. And so when you think about when you dispatch stuff, that's happening right in the event handler. All right, so where do action effects go? Event handlers, right? Technically, sort of, not really. So they really happen in
the font's rough.
But these state transitions, especially in React, just so happen to be executed at the same time as these event handlers. So as a step one, I would say try to move all of your effects away from useEffect and put them in those event handlers. Unless, of course, they're synchronizing effects or activity effects. So a better way to manage this, at least in my opinion, is to use external stores. And so I don't really recommend, I love this hook, by the way, using external store, but I don't recommend you use it directly. So useSyncExternalStore is really cool because you have a component, and this component can communicate with the store in which it could sync with it, and it could also
that font would make me go crazy, for sure.
Might have methods such as dispatch or send or whatever, and this store can be the thing that both holds your state and executes all of your effects. So it's pretty nice. Here's an example of its usage. The API is actually pretty straightforward. You grab some store from somewhere. I know that React Redux uses useSyncExternalStore, I believe, and also Xstate as well. And you provide a way to subscribe and to get a snapshot.
useSyncExternalStore is still like brand new. It's only React 18, I thought.
Interact with it in any which way you want. So Xstate, of course, is my library. It's a library for state machines and state charts, and it also lets you declaratively manage your effects too. And so Xstate is using synchExternalStore under the hood as well. This allows Xstate to be in total control of executing these effects. So these effects will execute without you having to do anything inside of useEffect. And other state management and React libraries work actually the same way, where basically you're delegating control of the effects over to those libraries instead of you having to do it yourself. So in Xstate, just like we talked about with entry, exit, and transition actions, you could find those right in your, I'm just going to call it a fancy reducer. It's a machine definition. You could define your entry and exit actions, your transition actions, and even invocations, which are sort of like those synchronizing activity effects that we talked about. These are the ones where if you weren't using a state management library, you would typically put in useEffect. So when it comes to state management, we think about state stores, we think about state updates and subscribing to data and getting new data as it comes in, and events dispatching. But in my opinion, this is only part of the picture. We also want the ability to communicate with multiple stores, communicate with those stores, like send events to it, receive events.
Oh no, am I getting ads on YouTube now? I don't have
the most important part of this talk, and also maybe even handle finite states and transitions.
Do I have any of my YouTube mods around right now, or do I have to deal with
now
this?
We're talking about state orchestration. So I'm going to go over a couple more patterns here. Sometimes it's actually really hard, if not impossible, to find.
Maple made a good point that there's too many esoteric concepts within Xstate, and usually we're fine in plain logic written with our library like MobX or Zustand or Jodi, and there's plenty of others as well. I find that we were actually pretty deep into planning an Xstate rewrite for our state machine. We decided last minute against it because we were going to try a different provider, and then gave up on that as well. And I just got angry and went and redid the whole thing in Zustand over a weekend. I found that my problem with Xstate, and this feels like both unique and petty, is that our complexity in state isn't at this higher level. Which state are we in? Because the state you're in is connected or disconnected, but the connected state has a bunch of chaotic substates within it. Like, is video enabled? Is audio enabled? How many users are there? What qualities do those users have on? Is one of those users pinned? What are the subscription states for each of those users? Which user should be subscribed, etc. One of the gotchas I found when we were using this architecture was that building the relationship between which tracks we should be pulling down from our server and which track should be rendered in the UI was annoying, because it meant that we had to, at a very high level, determine which users would be rendered, and then at a very low level, update that up the chain. Whereas if I manage subscription state as close to where the feed is rendered as possible, it made it significantly easier for us to reason about which tracks would be subscribed. And if we don't want a track subscribed, we can unmount that component. And it's worked very well.
Of you having to do it yourself.
Let's keep getting this free
In
content.
that state, just like we talked about with entry, exit, and transition actions, you could define those right in your, I'm just going to call it a fancy reducer. It's a machine definition. You could define your entry and exit actions, your transition actions, and even invocations, which are sort of like those synchronizing activity effects that we talked about. These are the ones where if you weren't using a state management library...
Also, HTTP Junkie, thank you for the sub. Really appreciate it.
So when it comes to state management, we think about state stores, we think about state updates and subscribing to data and getting new data as it comes in, and events dispatching. But in my opinion, this is only part of the picture. We also want the ability to communicate with multiple stores, communicate with those stores, like send events to it, receive events from it, effect management, which is the most important part of this talk, and also maybe even handle finite states and transitions. And this to me seems like state management plus plus. Now we're talking about state orchestration. So I'm going to go over a couple more patterns here. Sometimes it's actually really hard, if not impossible, to find that event handler and to execute an effect only once in there. So what you have to do is you have to do this weird, what's called a ref flag. And so you would say, is this executed yet? You would have a ref in there, set it to false.
I find I almost never need this. Like, if one of my dependencies changes, I do want to rerun the effect. And if I don't, I'm probably putting something of value in the ref, not a Boolean. Like, one example for this is connections, where if I'm re-rendering, I have a connection ref that I put the connection in when it's made, and then I check in the effect, is there a connection? If so, do something else. If not, make a connection and drop it in the ref. I think we've handled this already.
And if it's already executed, you're not going to execute it again. So you do your thing, and then you set executed ref.current is true. And so that way, when your effect reruns because of React 18 doing its thing or some other reason, it's going to check that flag, which is going to be stable. So that flag will stay true even when your component virtually unmounts and remounts. And so this will allow you to only run your effects truly once. So just think about this as like,
is it a virtual unmount remount, or is it a virtual re-render? Because if it's a virtual unmount remount, this ref wouldn't be stable. I think he's just wrong on this one. I'm pretty sure it's a fake re-render, not a fake unmount remount.
an escape.
I don't know what's going on with 18. I'm not going to pretend I do.
Really wants to use effect. And so you might be looking at this flag and thinking, okay, this seems like a really big red flag. Like, why am I using a ref in my effects? But honestly, this is the least awkward way to do it. So, yeah. And also, what about fetching data? You know, we have fetch on render. This is one of the most popular, use cases of useEffect. We have useQuery, useSWR, but I'm here to say that fetch on render is actually a lie. You know, sorry to those libraries, React Query, SWR, because you're supposed to, or at least the React team wants you to really move towards a pattern of render as you fetch. And so suspense is really
I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. That scene.
really, really great for this. And so this means that you're going to find that event handler that we talked about. You're going to start fetching in there, and all you have to do is read that in your components and make use of suspense. Or you could ditch the use effects altogether and use frameworks such as Remix or Next, which make it really easy to just get rid of these. They didn't pay me, but
no, they don't.
They will, hopefully. I'll talk to them. All right.
You know what? I'm going to wear some egg on my face. Fuck it. Remix makes this slightly easier. Next does not make this easier. Neither give a good data hydration story, and neither solve a lot of async problems that aren't network. This should useQuery be used at a component level to fetch all of your critical data? Probably not. But fuck. Like, there's a lot of value that you can get out of useQuery, and maybe not use SWR. I'll admit use SWR is just kind of bad. Like it's a use case that I don't run into almost ever. And if I did, I would probably want to hydrate the data better and fetch it earlier. So yeah, use SWR is not something I recommend often. Use query as a way to orchestrate data throughout your application and fetch async stuff. Yeah. Maple just put it really well. Pet peeve, people pretending every React app is just a front end to a database that does HTTP gets and nothing else. I've gotten into so much shit for saying that some of these frameworks feel like they were architected by somebody who like exclusively builds like dashboards and like e-commerce sites. Seriously, like I'm legitimately not trying to toot my own horn. I don't think what I'm doing is better, and I don't think I'm better for doing what I'm doing. But holy fuck, building a video application with like all these crazy dynamic behaviors and all even like virtual cam, infinite loop in, like building an app that has however many like infinite actions in here using freaking like built-ins, infinite use effects and framework primitives that don't do what we need them to is just not a viable path. And as somebody just said in chat, wow, the site is fast. You're damn right it's fast. It flies. And it's actually slower than it should be right now because I have a huge state overhaul that makes it way faster coming very soon. People are treating this like it's the minority. I totally agree. And I will admit that in terms of the web, this is the minority. The vast majority of websites are mostly static. That's the reality of the web. However, and this is the part we don't acknowledge enough, the majority of web developers are more split than that because a web app takes more developers than 10 websites. I know that because I maintain 10 websites myself, and I had to build a company and a team to run our web app. It is significantly more eng lift and significantly more engs period to build an app than a website. And if we keep pretending every developer is just building websites, then React's going to look pretty bad because React is for apps too. And a lot of what I build is apps and needs to work well for application experiences. The speed of this website is not replicable in Remix. Period. Sorry, the speed of this web app is not replicable in Remix without a lot of effort. Anyways.
They didn't pay me, but they will, hopefully. I'll talk to them. All right. So just to give you an example of like the code that you save with fetching data, this is a typical thing that we do. And honestly, this is what I taught at React training workshops, where it's like, okay, you have to set this awkward canceled flag, and then you fetch some resource, and then you, if it was canceled due to the cleanup, then you have to make sure not to run the effect again. But look at suspense. This is all you need. And so, you know, I know you love your use query and use SWR, but really moving towards suspense just makes things a lot easier. All right, so speaking of code saved, this is our useEffect example. This is when we move it into an event handler. And so when we take this and we say, you know what, I'm going to let these effects run in some store that both manages my states and manages my effects, then this shrinks down to this. And all you're doing in that event handler is sending an event. That's all you're doing. And so it doesn't matter which library you use to do this. Obviously, Xstate handles effects. React has a new action listener middleware that does it. And I'm sure other state management libraries do it. It's just do action listener.
I wanna. So, what I don't like about this one. Oh, yo, Alistair. LMG uses our tech for their shows. For whenever they have a guest call in for the WAN show, they're using our stuff. Love LMG. Luke's a good friend. But yeah, what I don't like about this example is this logic of the submit data, then catch all the error handling in this. This still exists. He's hidden it under the use form store. If we were to use mutation this, do I have to React code sandbox once again? So this is pseudocode because I don't feel like installing the package. Const mutate data equals use mutation. And what's it called? Submit data. Give this data. Cool. I'll even have mutate data error. And using React query, in particular in this case, use mutation from React query, we don't have to write something external. We don't have to import anything but use mutation, which is a very consistent, understandable pattern. I'm not importing some magic. I'm importing something pretty standard in the code base, especially if you're already using it. You pass it a function that does a promise in this case. So submit data, we're assuming this is a promise that does something. It can throw if it fails. It can return data if it succeeds. And then in the button here, we have like button on click equals mutate message test button. Cool. Did one too many of those, I think. Yeah. So if we had React query here, then this would give us the mutation, which done here is the on submit. We put in a form instead, same difference. We have the error state still because it's inlined using the use mutation call. And we have all of the logic still living here. We haven't hidden it behind the scenes in a weird import. I can still see what we're calling here. I don't like this. I think this is another one of those bad faith examples where you intentionally hid the red and yellow under here. If you were to compare this left example and his example with the actual source code, his with the source code would actually have more code than the example he's comparing it to on the left. And this use mutation example, this is all of the code. We're done here. Thank you for the sub, Good Barn. Really appreciate that. Thank you guys again for hanging out. I'm pumped that I can just like watch someone else's video and shout and still maintain almost 200 viewers across platforms. Thank you guys so much for hanging out here.
And I'm sure other state management libraries do it. It's just like actually my call to action for these other state management libraries is to realize that effects are state management. They shouldn't be treated as this other thing. So don't put side effects aside and really manage your effects with your state management. You could do it in a declarative way. You could do it in a pure way. But just that notion of saying, here's the effects that I want to run due to this state transition, that's really powerful. And that's actually going to help you with testing as well. So in summary, useEffect is for synchronization, not for effects. Even though synchronization can be considered an effect, that's not the main purpose of useEffect. State transitions are what trigger.
My point is biased and so is his. Sure, everyone has bias. The difference here is I'm not hiding things underneath sketchy imports. I'll show you guys my code, and I always do, probably to a fault. I show you guys my mistakes often too. Yeah. Yeah, it's the presentation is what I'm frustrated with. Thank you, Maple, for drawing the distinction there. There's a lot of points David makes here that I actually like strongly agree with. The problem is he is presenting it in a way that feels as though he is hiding the complexity of the topics he's touching upon to strengthen his point, rather than acknowledging the complexities inherent to some of the solutions he's recommending, as well as the alternatives that he's glancing over. There's a lot of, you can't oversimplify to try and sell something. Yeah, that's the point I really like. So something I strive for at Ping, like our product is solving a complex problem and it's our goal to make the solution as simple as possible. But there are things we don't do and we have to acknowledge that. And there are things that we make harder and we have to acknowledge that. And I goes out of my way to do that acknowledgement constantly because it makes you intimately familiar with those pain points and so much more likely to, how do I put it? You solve the problems you talk about the most. You ignore the problems you're scared to talk about the most. And this feels like there's pieces that he hid underneath to make his points rather than using them to strengthen his points by improving the angle of attack. And that's why I'm not as fond of this overall. I agree with the core points, and I very much agree with the overall goal here, in particular, abstracting as much state out of React as possible and being more focused on actions rather than effects and side effects of effects. That's a really good point. And state transitions triggering effects.
Trigger effects.
Yeah, good point overall.
And effects go in event handlers. So find the event handler that triggers your effect and put the effect in there. Also, render as you fetch with suspense, and model effects with state machines. So with that, thank you, Reactathon.
Cool. Good talk overall. I'm happy I watched this. I'm really happy that we had here, or that I took the time to watch this here.
Hi. I can't really say I'm new to this YouTube thing anymore. I've been doing it for a while, but I haven't been doing the YouTube part very well. So please, like this video, subscribe, share it with some friends if you can, leave a comment, just ask a question or something, whatever it takes, but please subscribe and watch the video and like it. I know it sounds dumb, but it does help a ton. And we're on that grind, baby. Thank you.